Hello, and welcome to Podround, the brand new podcast bringing you the best of royal podcasting each week. This week, we're bringing you 3 podcasts from some great podcasters, and we're going to mix it up between legacy media like the broadsheets and the podcasts that they bring us, and from some independent podcasters, and seeing the difference between the two again. So, the first one we're going to choose is Palace Confidential. This is a podcast brought to us by the Daily Mail. And what I've done this week is look at 2 of their different podcasts. One is Palace Confidential, which is like a roundup of all of the Daily Mail's best from the royal reporting that they've done during the week. On Palace Confidential, it's presented by Joe Elvin, Rebecca English, who is the royal editor, and Richard Eden, who is the diary editor of the Daily Mail. And it's very much from the Daily Mail's perspective. And for those of you who are out of the UK, it's a right-wing conservative newspaper, and the journalists that are featured on Palace Confidential are on the royal rota. So they're briefed by the palace, they go on the press trips with all the royals, and they've really got sort of first-hand access to the royal events and everything that's going on there. So their approach to the news is slightly dumbed down, I would say. From an opinion perspective, they try not to get too controversial because they don't want their access taken away from them. So they try to toe the line while also giving an indication of how they feel about certain stories or certain people within the royal family. This week, they start with their coverage of Prince William's attendance at the enthronement of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the first woman to be the Archbishop of Canterbury for 1400 years. So it's quite a historical occasion. But it started a conversation around William's own attitude towards faith and a bit of a debate over the fact that he's going to be, when he exceeds the throne, the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. So it was interesting to see how they covered that. And then moving on to Charles, who is actually King Charles III, we look at his pub visit in Cornwall. And also, this was quite interesting from Rebecca English's point of view, because she was actually with him when he visited this pub, which was launching a new 0% ale. And a little bit of a joke that they had over the pouring of a pint and the sampling of this new ale. They covered Beatrice and her marriage that is in trouble with Edo, and that was riffing straight off a report that was in the Mail on Sunday by Charlotte Griffiths. There was some talk about the state visit from Nigeria and how it's the biggest table in the world, seating 160 people, and how that table is laid and how long it takes. And again, there's some really interesting behind the scenes talk. They talk about Camilla and what might be happening with her if Charles passes on before her. What would she do with her charities, with osteoporosis, literacy, and abuse and domestic violence? And then they sort of land on the Harry and Meghan stories that are floating around, talking about the Netflix breakdown and the new Polo program, which is a fictional drama that they are producing. And there's some talk about also their Australia tour and the petition that's being signed to ask the government not to allow taxpayers' money being spent on that tour. Interesting debate about, and I didn't know this, but they made a snarky comment back via the Sussex's PR people saying that they weren't going to be using taxpayers' money. And they talk about the sort of tone of voice that the Sussexes use. And you can tell that they're not particular fans of Harry and Meghan. They talk about Project Thor then, which is a rumoured operation that's being driven by the palace to help pave the way back for Harry and Meghan into the UK. They talk about Boris Johnson's column in the Mail on Sunday about how he thinks Harry and Meghan should come back. And this is the ex-Prime Minister. And also Tina Brown, who's a really well-known editor and journalist, and she has her own Substack, and where she's written about the fact that she believes that Harry and Meghan should be brought back in. And they finally finish it all off with the story about Fergie and a reality show that she's been trying to pitch to clone the Queen's corgis. These are two dogs that were given to the Queen before she died by the ex-Prince Andrew and Fergie. And now they've come back to Andrew and Fergie's been trying to do some very odd money-making missions to make some TV. And one of the ideas was to clone the corgis, which really wasn't the greatest idea on this earth. But anyway, we'll move on. Now, another show straight from the same makers is Palace Authorised. And I really, really enjoyed this particular show because it's a one-on-one interview between Joe Elvin and Hugo Vickers about his book that he's written just recently called Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History. And we will put a link in here to that book if you'd be interested in picking that book up. And indeed, there are links to all of the podcasts that we talk about in the show notes at the bottom of the page here. So Hugo Vickers is a very well-respected author. He's written many books, and this book is essentially taking you on a trip all the way through the most significant parts of her life. And Joe Elvin talks really beautifully to Hugo Vickers because she's actually reading the way he feels really passionately about his subject. And in one part of this podcast, he talks about the Crown and how he fundamentally got so upset by the way the Crown tried to rewrite history that he decided that he was going to do his own book debunking every single episode with a chapter of the book dedicated to each episode of The Crown to show how wrong The Crown was in its portrayal of Elizabeth's life. And I think this was absolutely a brilliant bit of insight to Hugo Vickers. But the sort of things that he talks about here are from his own perspective, because he spent time in the Queen's company and he observed himself what she was like. Things like her incredible memory or her sense of humour. He talks about how she sort of built her outlook based on the time that she spent growing up in the war years in World War II, and all about her motherhood and her accession to the throne, and how at 25 years old, she was actually ready to come to the throne. He takes us all the way through real significant parts of her history, including her love of the Commonwealth and her perspective from a personal tragedy point of view when Lord Mountbatten was killed by the IRA, and how many, many years later she had to become the Queen rather than the woman when she was shaking hands with Martin McGuinness to help facilitate peace. He has great insight into some other key moments of her reign, including Michael Fagin breaking into Buckingham Palace, or the blanks that were shot when she was riding her horse in the Trooping of the Colour, and how she was able to control her horse with the sort of calm that you'd expect of the most experienced of riders. Then right the way through to the marriage of Diana and Charles and Diana's death, and how she came in for so much criticism when Diana died and she was staying in Balmoral to look after the young princes. Right the way through then on to Charles's wedding to Camilla and William and Catherine's wedding, and how at William and Catherine's wedding she was the happiest that anybody had ever seen her at any of the weddings. And then the interview finishes off with the Queen's final days and how sad it was. And one thing that really stuck in my memory of this whole podcast was the fact that she said that she felt that she was in her departure lounge in her final days. And so it was quite a poignant ending to that podcast. But I really would encourage you to go and take a look at that and click on the link that's in the notes below. So moving on to a completely different vibe and a completely different type of podcaster, we have Lauren the Insider. Now, I really identify with Lauren because she is, like me, a YouTube commentator. She's a bit more of a media personality than I am. She appears on lots of shows like Dan Wootton's show and Shauna's show with the Vintage Read podcast and many others. And she has, like me, over 20 years of experience in media and PR. And she uses her platform to discuss all things royal. She really is somebody who can understand the stories from a PR person's perspective. Laura and I share that same lens. We're looking at why a story's being placed in a certain publication, or what the backstory must be to it. And she really understands the media as well, and who they're targeting, and what their impact and impetus is. So the first podcast, I'm focusing on two of them because Lauren does good, short, sharp podcasts. So I've got a bit of time to talk about how she's done two of her podcasts, and these have a common theme. The first one was an interview that she did with Andrew Loney, who's one of my favourite authors. And here she really zoned in on how the media is being put off writing about Andrew Loney, and how events are being told to not have him at events. She really believes that the palace is trying to shut Andrew Loney down. Now, Andrew Loney, for those of you who don't know, is the writer of a brilliant biography called Entitled, of Prince Andrew, and indeed of the House of York, of his marriage to Fergie and their whole history. And there's a new paperback version of Entitled coming out in May, which has some addendums after the most recent Epstein files releases. So it's worth taking a look at that book as well. But this is a Sunday Times best-selling author. And one thing that Lauren the Insider really focuses on is the fact that he's also one of the leading literary agents in the UK as well. So when he tells her that he has been dismissed from literary festivals and events that he would previously have been booked at, Lauren's ears sort of pricked up there, and she took him down a certain course of the interview, talking about who would be the people that were stopping him. And you sense in this interview also his frustration at his attempts to give the palace, give the police all sorts of evidence that he's uncovered about Andrew and his questionable activities as a trade envoy. And they go as far as to say that Andrew Loney believes that treason could be something that can be levelled at the ex-Prince Andrew. And as we know, the ex-Prince Andrew was arrested and questioned, and it's yet to be found out whether anything is going to happen there. But Andrew Loney has a very, good insight and good predictions to be made about what he thinks is coming next from the palace. After that interview, Laura then takes on the narrative and talks more about the seriousness of what's been going on at Buckingham Palace, and how, these are really serious allegations, not only treason, but sex trafficking. And she said, and I thought this was a great line when she said she feels like Jeffrey Epstein was using Buckingham Palace like Soho House, the way he was able to ask whether one of the princesses, Beatrice or Eugenie, would show him round in one of his requests in the emails from the Epstein files. Lauren's really good about talking about the age of transparency, and she can see, and she says it very eloquently, when news stories are filtered through the mainstream media. And she's very opinionated. Definitely worth taking a look at this interview with Andrew Loney. And another episode, which we'll link in the notes, is about another book writer, another author called Tom Bower. And he has written a book about Meghan and Harry. And she's also seen how Tom Bower's being shut down. And she feels that sort of almost like dark forces are at work. And she zones in particularly in this episode on a morning show in the UK where Tom Bower appeared as a guest to talk about his book, and how Kat Deely, who was one of the interviewers, has a big thing in common with Meghan Markle. She is also a really good friend of Marcus Anderson, who's the Soho House guy. And she really believes that Meghan has briefed Marcus Anderson to brief Cat Deeley against Tom Bower. Now, Lauren the Insider says that the questions that Cat Deeley and Ben Shepherd, the two co-hosts of this show, were asking were unprofessional at best, but bordering on the offensive. They were trying to make out that he hadn't researched his subject material properly. And this is a man who's an ex-barrister. I mean, he's a prolific author and a prolific researcher. If anything, his books are too sourced. I mean, I've read a few of them, and they are intense reams of detail in these books. So I can't see how they could possibly level a criticism at Tom Bower that he didn't have great sources and hadn't done his research properly. Because if there's anybody who writes a book that's detailed and forensically researched, it's that man. So Lauren the Insider has picked up, I think this is a bit of a scoop, because nobody else has picked up on the fact that Cat Deeley and Meghan Markle share this best friend in Marcus Anderson. And also she notices in this podcast that the lack of mainstream coverage on the book, she puts it down to maybe palace dark forces at work, but I think it might also be because he got this book serialized in the Times. And when a book is serialized ahead of its release, it kind of annoys the other media. And they think, well, that's a Times book. We won't go near that. So I think it's more likely, or at least 50% of the reason would be that they saw that as something that had gone to the Times as an exclusive and they weren't going to touch it. So that's Lauren the Insider. Check her out. A fellow PR supremo. Moving on to the Royalist. My favourite, Tom Sykes. He really is my favourite. He comes at royal stories from the perspective of a real insider. He went to the same school as Harry and William. They share the same sort of connections and contacts, and he's been writing about the royal family for years. So his grip on history is fantastic. What he's talking about in this particular episode is the news that came out about Prince Harry, for want of a better word, blackmailing the king about not being able to see his grandchildren if he doesn't invite him to the UK. And this all revolves around Harry wanting to get his security back. Now, if you're not above this story, the security is a huge thorny issue. He lost that security when he ceased to be a working royal and moved abroad. Security is paid for by the English taxpayer, so the British taxpayer, I should say. And so it is for people who are serving us as the working royal family. What Prince Harry wants is to be able to tap into that level of security when he decides to come and go from the country. And isn't too far a stretch of the imagination to understand that nobody is really that happy about wanting to pay for Prince Harry to be able to jet in and jet out of the United Kingdom whenever he likes, and not be doing the role of a working royal. So he's getting increasingly frustrated. This decision is, the King Charles says, not made by King Charles, but it's made by RABIC, which is a committee made up of, yes, people from the palace, but also from the government. And it's a cross-party committee as well. And they will assess whether they think that he's entitled to have his security back. And Prince Charles has said that, King Charles has said that it's not his decision to make. Harry doesn't believe that, so he's trying to put the pressure on King Charles. And this isn't going down very well with the palace, with King Charles, with anybody. Tom also looks at this story through the lens of Prince William. It's an interesting lens because Tom asserts that when a royal monarch is coming to the end of their monarchy, as we know that King Charles has cancer, so, he has a terminal illness, you see authority and the power being passed to the heir before the heir actually accedes to the throne. And so from Tom's perspective, he sees that decision about security and about Harry's comings and goings, really sitting also and possibly more so with Prince William. So again, an interesting perspective from Tom. Then he moves on to talk about Beatrice and Eugenie. This was a breaking story at the beginning of the week, talking about the fact that Beatrice and Eugenie have been told not to come to the Easter service at Sandringham. Now, this is a really important royal church service. It's possibly just as important, if not more important, than the Christmas walkabout that they do after the Christmas service at Sandringham. Every year, a lot of the royals turn up and go to this service. And Beatrice and Eugenie have historically been there. But they've been told this year not to come, just like they've been told not to attend the Ascot races, for example, and some other events. Now, the palace gave out a statement saying that they weren't attending with the agreement and the understanding of the king. And it went on to say, and I love the way that Tom Sykes particularly breaks down the words that are used in these statements. The sisters have not been ostracized and are expected to attend future events. And Tom zoned in on the word expected. It's an interesting take on this because he's saying on the one hand, they've been told not to come, but on the other hand, the palace is saying they will be expected to be at other things. So it's all a bit contradictory and a bit confusing. But he says that that's the wont of the palace eternally. That's what the palace does. Interestingly as well, he makes a note of William not attending the service usually on Easter Sunday. And this sort of takes us back to that first podcast that we started with, talking about William's faith. And, the fact that he has more of a quiet faith. And certainly when he accedes to the throne, he will have a different attitude and approach to his role as the supreme governor. So that's Tom Sykes' podcast, The Royalist. Now, Tom is a very prolific podcaster, and he also podcasts for The Daily Beast. So it's definitely worth clicking on his link in the notes below. Do subscribe to that as well, because he has coming up a great interview with the chief correspondent of Variety, a chap called Matt Donnelly, who wrote the article that was about the takedown of a troubled relationship with Netflix of Harry and Meghan. So do take a look at that. Well, thank you for listening to Podround. We are first and foremost pod fans, and we love all things podcast. So to start with, we're going to be concentrating on the royals as we have done, but we'll be taking deep dives into other subjects. So contact us, comment. You can contact us at Substack by searching for Podround. Drop us a comment on any place that you are consuming your podcast, and look out for us every week. See you next time.